I think we should be live, but I'll get a confirmation. Yes, so we are
Cool.
live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a book discussion with Professor Aditeshwar Seth, who is a computer science professor at IIT Delhi. And he has a book that he has authored, Technology and Disempowerment, a call to technologists. So to give a brief background about Professor Seth, he also happens to be a co-founder of Gramvani, which is a communications platform towards agriculture and on the ground, decentralized platform for people on the ground to uh, disseminate information using community radios, and they've been doing this for a really long time. And they have other multiple projects that they have been working on. I think Professor Seth will explain about them as we discuss about the book. But before we go into it, uh, can you tell us what made you write this book in the first place? I know there were a lot of reasons why you do the work you do in terms of Gramvani and how you were empowering people in Indian villages through information. But has this to do with a lot of your own personal work, or what made you write this book?
Yeah. Thanks, Srinivas, and thanks to the Hasgeek network for organizing all this. Very happy to be here and to talk about all of this. Srinivas, to answer your question, I think so I started writing the book during actually the COVID lockdown, and I think the main motivation really came from probably two things, right? One, as a faculty in the computer science department, I was seeing that there's, of course, very good technical skills that we impart to the students, and the students go out into the industry, into the world, and build all sorts of great systems. But we weren't really getting them to think about problems that the technologies can also cause. And I mean, that, of course, it's not a new thing at all. All of us are aware of issues, misinformation, and so many other things, right, that have happened. So one part was about thinking about what more should students know and be open to thinking about critically when it comes to the kind of technologies and systems that they will go out and build in the world. And I think the second part was that when, for example, we started Gramvani, then this whole space of using technology for social good, this was sort of small. And now there is a lot actually happening. There are so many startups, social enterprises, and the use of technology has really increased a lot. But again, even over here, we are seeing many gaps that technologies which are projected as being useful and to do social good, but very often they miss out on certain fundamentals. Maybe the technologies are not not easy to use by poor people, by less tech savvy people, and many of these aspects are ignored. So the book is really an attempt to bring out some of these issues, that why does technology sometimes lead to disempowerment? So the title also, the in disempowerment is in brackets. So not to say that technology is not good, but to really try and understand when does it go wrong and what can we do to try to ensure that it doesn't.
I think, okay, when you go into the book, you also explain how some of the book is based on your personal experiences, and you then look into the idea of Marxist humanism and how technology is being produced, right? And what are the challenges with this production of technology? And you also address the issue of alienation among technology workers. Do you want to start a bit with that, and then we go into social good and the contemporary problems?
So the part about Marxist humanism and alienation, that basically, so what Marx basically talked about is that social relationships are created through production relations, that when you're producing some goods for somebody else and it actually fulfills a genuine use value for that consumer, that creates a very strong positive social relationship. In the same way, if you're working together in a group and the setting is non-coercive, it's not exploitative, then that's the other setting in which that during the production process are the social relationships that are being created during this production process, are they non-coercive? And similarly, in terms of the use of the products, are the relationships again non-coercive, non-exploitative, which basically means that are the producers not exploiting the consumers? Yeah. And if there is exploitation, then that's what Marx says, it leads to alienation. That as in general, right? Right. I don't think anybody, very few people would actually be evil, sort of. So you do want to have good outcomes emerging from your work. You also want to work in good settings, but the alienation arises when some of these fundamentals are violated. Now, many times you may not be aware that some of your actions are causing harm. At times you might be aware and you may not be able to, however, change the situation. So, so that's the part that I bring out, that Marxist humanism is really about being able to address some of these issues, with being able to understand when some things are going wrong, when these social relationships are negative, and do we have the ability to fix them? And a lot of it, so you started with asking about how this emerged from my work with Gramani. So yeah, I mean, the motivation really came from trying to do good for society. And then a lot of the challenges that we face in the process, that's some of the things I talk about, that things that we learn, that why is it hard to ensure that good outcomes actually do emerge from your work. And then it's also informed by frustrations that we want this work to scale, we want this work to grow, but what sort of hinders that? Which sort of hinders this whole humanism process that we are trying to move towards.
So, at some level, you put the foundation of your entire book on humanism, and it's a call for technologists to think about their role in society, and in a very transactional way, where technologists are producers of technologies, and how technology platforms, like as you describe in your book, Uber or Facebook, are essentially creating some of these alienation. And also you look at technology as a double-edged sword, where it could be used for a social good, and it could also disempower. So when you start defining social good, and before you even go there, you looked into these ideas of the contemporary challenges with technology. Why is technology creating these problems? And where do you think the shift is? Like, where do you think the shift has taken place in terms of the contemporary problems that we see emerge with technology, which did not probably exist 10 years ago?
Yeah, no, exactly. So the place where I go with this whole setup is that, I mean, if you take the humanist argument, right, that the technology or outputs of your labor that you produce with this technology, that should lead to some positive social relationships. So that ultimately leads to this answer that you should work towards helping those which are disenfranchised, those who are disempowered, right, and try to bring more equality, so that you're not really working in an exploitative kind of a setup. So when we talk about what kind of technology platforms have come up and whether they are able to preserve these values or are these values being violated, so that's the part where I then go deeper into that. various reasons why some of these things are missed out. And sometimes, right, you hear this word about unintended outcomes. Now, typically, one of the things I argue is that a lot of these unintended outcomes arise because the technologists did not think very deeply about the social technical interface, because it's when different segments of society, the world is complex, society is complex, right? You might have built a lot of ethics into your technology, but when diverse segments of users start using it, there will be surprises that will emerge. And that's one part where many of these unintended outcomes arise. And that then leads to this further realization that it's not just that you need to design the technology in some ethical manner, but even during the management of the technology, once it's deployed, you want to take many of these same values. You want to ensure that many of these same values are also being followed at that point. So with contemporary technologies, these are places where we've seen many of these things going wrong, either in not taking thinking things through properly, or even when things are deployed, ignoring some of the issues that have been surfacing, people have been talking about, right? So this is very much linked to, right, things like whistleblowing that we've seen happening with platforms like Facebook, or protests by civil society on problems that many digital public goods have caused, in like unfair denial of welfare services and these kind of aspects, right? So it's all about missing out on many of these cases where the technology or the processes are failing and letting it fall through the cracks. Yeah, and that's what then leads to, you know, this these issues, and which then, if Marx is right, eventually it will alienate the technologists, and they would want to come around to do the right thing.
So I think in chapter 3, when you talk about the idea of social good, and you describe how you create a set of framework on what social good should look like, and the idea of social good itself is not cannot be the fundamental basis of developing or designing any technology, and you then go on into creating ethical frameworks for it, right? But you have set up the base for this in terms of inequality in the previous chapter, where you address the idea of inequality and why the need for social good is important when technologists produce new forms of technology. Can you explain a bit more about why is it that the present systems of that are driving inequality are so heavily interlinked to technology production?
Yeah, well, so that's happening for many reasons, right? So one is that something that Kentaro Toyama talks about in his book Geek Heresy, that technology often tends to amplify inequality. And that's typically, I mean, processes like people who are more tech savvy, they will end up using it more easily. People who have access will be the first ones to use it. And that's how it ends up amplifying some of these inequalities. And the way to set that right is make these technologies more inclusive, more accessible, potentially work on capacity building of marginalized groups so that they can use it more easily. So that's one aspect because of which this happens. The other is that a lot of the tech is ultimately coming out from a capitalist system, and it promises returns to investors, and it naturally then again gravitates towards systems where it's either about expanding the market or about further surplus extraction from these markets. So that's the other reason. And again, the answer to that is not easy because, I mean, the only way to keep a check on capitalism and then it translates into any technologies or any products developed by capitalism, right? It's typically, right, regulation, which we know is not that straightforward. Consumer ethics, which again we know is not that straightforward. So this is another reason why I place sort of a lot of responsibility on the technologists, because ultimately they're in the capitalist system, but they are building these tools. They are writing the code, right? Somebody is writing the code for Uber or for any of these algorithms, right? Which are chasing certain objectives, which are profit maximizing. So if we can build a stronger ethos among the technologists, then that can really transform this from the inside. Instead of having institutions trying to keep a check on capitalism, right? Can it be transformed from the inside? And because technology is such a fundamental part of the world and all industries today, so I think computer technologists, information technologists have an even more important role to play to potentially change this from within.
So you also say that this idea of social good, that when we talk about building for social good, right, is consequentialist, that the consequence of the technology will determine whether that technology is good or bad. It's not the intention of or how the way the technology itself was entirely produced, but the outcomes of the technology on how it's being used on the ground and what sort of effects it has on the society, right? Can you explain a bit more on this rationale that you have taken on why social good is important when technology production is, when we're debating how to design any new form of technology system? And I believe you looked into Aadhaar a bit and how also compared the Aadhaar with Gramvani and Facebook in terms of its consequences on the ground.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the first part to this is that I mean, one thing that we hear often is that a technologist might say that, well, my job is to just build a system according to specifications. Yeah. Sometimes they might also say that my job is just to build the infrastructure. It's somebody else's responsibility to make sure that it's used properly, it leads to some social good, right? And right. So my argument over here basically is that that's not enough. You need to think about what the technology will ultimately be used for. What is the purpose of this technology? And if it is not about neutralizing power inequalities, then you should really think about, right? How can I make sure that the technology just gets used towards that? Because if not, then many of these processes, like the technology being more easily used by by tech-savvy users, or like the capitalist kind of thing that we were talking about, it would end up amplifying many of these inequalities. So that is why I say that we should, whenever we're designing technology, we should think about the end use to which we are thinking about it, and that will also give a certain, essentially like a steering ability, because the tech will go wrong on and off, and we will have to set it right. We will have to continuously keep redesigning it, continuously keep managing it, but we would know where we want to go with that thing, rather than think about it simply as an instrument that can be used by anybody. So then when we sort of compare, I mean, use this to think about, right, what kind of outputs or were considered for something like Gramvani or something like Aadhaar, and then to think about what are the values that are behind this, then you can sort of start trying to evaluate these systems. So for example, with Aadhaar, the goal right from the outset was framed in terms of reducing leakages in welfare, delivery of welfare benefits. And but then we know that things like, if you talk about the public distribution system, then things like identity fraud are, so Professor Ritika Khera has written so much about these things, and things like identity fraud are much rarer. there are other things like quantity fraud in the Russian that are more important, and Aadhaar is not going to address any of those. Right? But while meeting this goal, what other values should also have been incorporated but were sidelined, right? So that's what brings us to cases where wherever the technology is going wrong, let's say the biometrics are failing or the people's names are spelled incorrectly and it's very difficult for them to correct those names. So how much investment has been made to fix these issues, right? So this kind of an evaluation helps us understand that the original objective that was for these technologies, which was to do social good, and it was sort of framed in this way that it will reduce leakages and improve public utilization of public funds, which is all great. But then in the process, many other values have also been violated. So this whole framework of trying to think in terms of the end goals for social good and think in terms of ethical values that are being incorporated to meet these goals, right? So that framework can be used to evaluate systems, right? Any of these Aadhaar or platforms or right, any kind of a technology project.
Okay, so while you set the framework for what's failing in your early chapters, right? You actually give foundations, an ethics-based foundation on how to potentially build something for social good. You also talk about why we attempt to do this, because you're essentially talking about a bunch of technologists coming together and potentially talking about an ideal system that could be built, or creating a framework to ensure that technology doesn't alienate, technologists doesn't alienate themselves and technology doesn't disempower people, right? But in this process, you also look at the limitations of how we design technology itself, whether it's through participatory approaches, whether the design process in itself is not entirely good enough to build something for social good. Yes. Can you expand on why you think so?
Yeah. I mean, many challenges sort of come in the process, right? So, for example, when engineers who are building these technologies, right, if they're not exposed to the context of the users, if they're not exposed to who will be able to use these technologies, who will not be able to use it. And very often, I mean, there are design teams, and the design teams kind of try to get some of these inputs and convey them to the engineers. But there can be losses in this whole process, right? If organizational structures are fragmented, then these kind of things can be missed. Similarly, how much attention the organization itself might be placing in terms of ensuring that the right ethical values are being ensured during the design, during the management of the technologies, right? Issues where the technology might be going wrong, those are actually being addressed. So there's also an organizational mandate over here in terms of how much attention they're putting to these things. So that again is something that comes in the way of not being able to build the right tools or being able to address some of these issues. Right? Very similarly, all of this is embedded in a fundamental capitalist system, and I mean, when it comes to technology, especially, there is so much focus on innovation, rapid scaling, things like number of users, user acquisition costs, user retention costs. And I mean, these are the kind of metrics that investors, for example, talk about. And if you're continuously chasing these metrics, then you will obviously not be able to follow, so you mentioned participatory approaches, which anyway tend to be slow, because you've got to see the technology, you've got to observe how people are using it, you've got to, in fact, involve them in the design process, which could even mean, right, even building the capacity of the community to be able to even participate in the design process, whether they have enough time to even do that. All of those things come in the way. And But this race to rapidly scale, right? It basically means that many of these things are ignored. Maybe it's not deliberate. Maybe people just leave it for later. That we'll get to it. Let us first build this thing first. So these are many of the things which basically come in the way of even if technologists are aware. First of all, I mean, being aware itself is a challenge, and that's one of the places where I do talk about the need for public spheres for technologists to be able to interact with their users so that they're able to understand each other's context. And right, but even given sufficient awareness, there are many impediments in the technology production ecosystem where these values might be sidelined. Yeah.
So you talk about a lot of this in your own personal experiences during building technology within the Gramvani system, right? So you go into them in detail. How has been that experience?
Yeah, I mean, actually, all of this learning has truly emerged through practice. I mean, through Gramvani, because so when we started, right, I started as a typical technologist, right, with this very naive notion that we'll build tech and it'll change the world. And but it was actually when we started seeing, right, we started noticing gaps. I mean, very much like one of the things I was talking about, that when we so we said that we got some things right in the beginning, that we'll do voice-based technologies so that it's more accessible to people. We also started using non-internet based technologies like community radio and IVR, interactive voice response systems, again with the idea that not everybody has internet access, right? But then when we actually started seeing who was using these technologies, right? That was sort of the first realization. We saw that, well, actually, it was more experienced users, younger people, for example, who were getting onto the technology more quickly. And in fact, to the extent that they would sometimes even exclude others. So in our systems, it's about people being able to record messages about problems they're facing, about, right, even right, local news, events, even poetry and songs that they want to record and share with their community. But we were even seeing cases where more experienced users would sort of feel that poor quality recordings degrade the overall user experience, and therefore, to the extent that rather than helping build the capacity of other groups to be able to also participate on the technology, they were actually restricting access. So, so these sort of things were really an eye-opening for, especially for a technologist like me, that actually there are many problems which we do need to think and we need to figure out how to solve. And I mean, as we went along, we built so many processes. The Gramvani team, the composition completely changed. That we were initially a team of techies, and we then built a community mobilization team, which recruits, identifies, and trains community volunteers. So that some of these inequities can be addressed. The community volunteers themselves, we try to ensure good representation so that they're coming from different caste and class and religion backgrounds, and so that they're able to bring their respective groups onto these platforms. And there is communication that happens across these groups, which is one of the values that we believe in, of being able to listen to plural voices. So we built all of that. We built content teams. We worked a lot on content moderation and editorial policies so that multiple viewpoints can be heard by other people. And of course, it took time. I would say, so one of the things I sort of said in the beginning, that we really want these kind of things to be more popular. I think the way we're doing it is very different from platforms. This is where some of these values, right, that I was talking about, that what's the social good goal that we're trying to work towards. I think it's very different. Our method is very different from social media companies. But yeah, I mean, we haven't managed to scale as much. I mean, we have a very good presence across the country, but I mean, we're, in terms of what we would want it to be, it's nowhere close to that. And the kind of challenges we face in this process have been, trying to do this in a capitalist system, where, right, so we can't raise commercial capital because in the communities you're working with such little disposable income, right, commercial investors aren't interested. Impact investors, we have a great set of impact investors and they've been super supportive, but the amount of capital is limited, the amount of risk that they can take is limited. So we understand it from their standpoint. But I mean, this is where the broader political economy sort of starts coming in, and it restricts how much social good can you really do.
So during your experiences when you explain with Gramani, right, you spoke of caste and the idea of power that comes into play. Apart, I mean, not just caste, but also the role of capital, right? So the framework that you are proposing in terms of designing technologies, in terms of production of technologies, is you actually recommend a lens of power. And you say that these technology systems are power infrastructures, right? Like they have a certain amount of power, and the people who are producing these technologies also yield a certain amount of power. And it is to them that you are addressing that you could design these systems in a very equitable way. And the only way to do that is through looking from the lens of power. Do you want to expand a bit more on why and how you came to this conclusion of how, if looking through the power lens helps us to design better technology systems?
Yeah, exactly. So I think power really sits at the heart of, many things, right? So if we talk about Marx in terms of exploitation, then power really rests in the hands of the person who's able to, right, take decisions on behalf of other people or coerce them. If we link that with technology, right, then technology, right, so there's the designers who are building the technology and then users of these technologies, right? So the designer definitely has far higher power in terms of what features they're providing to the users, right, which shapes. Then similarly, when a technology is introduced, right, it might have different sets of users, and the introduction of the technology changes the power equations between these users, right? So maybe the technology is making somebody more powerful. Maybe the existing, those who already have power, maybe they're gaining more power through the technology. In other cases, it might be neutralizing some of these power relationships. So, I mean, as an example, in Gramvani, we try to work a lot on local governance, trying to improve social accountability. And this is where people call into our platforms and they record problems that they're facing with government schemes. And then the volunteers actually take up these recordings to the block officials or district officials and they play it to them, right? And these are going on basically on a public platform, and it's actual voices of people saying, right, whatever, right, they're not paid their NREGA wages in time, or problems with food distribution or whatever, right? And then they also try to take a commitment from the government office, right? So here we're seeing that the technology is really putting power in the hands of the volunteers who are now able to use it to demand accountability from the government, as opposed to, let's say, places where the technology itself becomes a holder of power. I mean, this is sort of often the case with things like Aadhaar. I mean, how if things go wrong, how do you fix that? If your biometrics are not working, your spelling of your name is not right being matched, and then the bank transfers are failing, and the technology has taken a decision. No, it's not. I'm disallowing it. And how do you go about fixing it? So I mean, in all of these kind of cases, I was seeing that power can be a very useful, like a common construct to bring many of these things together, both in terms of, right, it can also help answer questions that who's designing the technology for what purpose, and what kind of power equations are they hoping that this will change. Right. So this is where it becomes very, very interesting to think in terms of who's
Also,
being empowered.
you attempted to model power in the book,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
you took actor network theory, you looked at it, and you also talk about its limitations
Yeah.
on how we can't essentially explain all the actors that are involved in this production of technology and these power structures that are emerging. Can you expand a bit on that? And
Yeah, actually, that is very incomplete work right now. That's something I want to develop more. That how do we sort of even formally start representing systems in terms of power? That if you introduce technology, right? So for power-based modeling, there's many things that I mean people have thought about. So power, for example, can emerge from resources that you possess. Resource could be wealth or knowledge, and which sort of gives you the ability to influence certain rules or certain outcomes. Um, so, so in the framework, that's one of the things I've tried. That how is the technology able to change some of the existing resources that different people possess? And then what outcomes would these resources then be able to influence? Um, right. So I mean, for example, right, if we think of like we were talking about the volunteers, right? If the volunteers are able to help with grievance redressal, it improves their credibility in the eyes of the community, which would then mean that if you think of all of this as a system, it would mean that more users would want to engage with the volunteers, would want to engage through mobile money. And the more users that are on mobile money, the power of mobile money itself will increase, because now officials or different local stakeholders would know that whatever voices are being aired on mobile money, right? They're being heard by many more people, and therefore they should take that into account. So essentially, in this power-based modeling, it actually rests on systems thinking, and in systems how we model flows and feedback loops. And so within that, I try to define certain kinds of resources like credibility or the ability to influence different stakeholders to take certain actions, and what are the interrelationships between them. But it's very early work. But yeah, I mean, if we can start describing systems formally, then it gives us I mean, it makes everything legible. I mean, that's something that computer science has helped to do, right? Or mathematics for that matter, right? To make many of these relationships to express them formally, because then you can start thinking about where to intervene in this whole setup.
so, in the end, you actually look at a host of ideas. Like your book is packed with problems and modeling and answers, potentially experiments that could potentially be carried out, the need for social participation. So you actually show force movements as a potential playground where all of these ideals that you talk about that technologists should have, uh, force movements have demonstrated a significant number of it. I won't say they're perfect, but they have significantly demonstrated how there can be alternate models of technology production which have collective good in mind, where the technology production is not being determined by capital profit as the idea, but providing alternate sources of technology. Uh, and you also talk about the need for collectivization among technologists, right? So, can you expand a bit more on that, and what is that you are trying to say when we talk about looking all of these problems and building systems in these directions.
Yeah, I mean, so exactly. I mean, all that you said, right? That there are many ways forward, right? To for technologists to basically do a better job in right, being more conscious about what goals are their technology is going to serve. Are they meeting these goals? Trying to steer it properly and right, take all of this into account. I mean, the FOSS movement is really an exemplar over here because I mean they sort of busted capitalism story, right? That everybody needs money, right? An incentive to do something, monetary incentive, and they show that no, that's not the thing, right? If your tech is being used by people, it's helping bring about some change, right? That's strong incentive in itself. Um, and similarly, the free software movement, I mean, which is right, I mean, free software being different from open software, right? So the free from in terms of Stallman's definition, right? So that also has right, basically Solvent was, I mean, it is taking a very counter position, right? I mean, as a position to counter proprietary tech. Open software sort of glosses over that. It says it's okay, right? As long as everybody, so for open software, improving the software is the main goal, and in whichever means. But I think Stallman's position is closer to what I'm saying, that there is a particular end goal for society that he has in mind. So the software is not the key artifact. The point is, what is the goal that the software or this free software movement is trying to address? So yeah, so I mean, Stallman shows this kind of a pathway. And then there's so many other positive things happening. So when we talk about collectivization, right? So that can technologists change their organizations from within. And I think we're seeing many of these things. So there's the Alphabet Workers Union, for example, which has come up, and the mandate is, I mean, most unions which emerged in the blue collar kind of setting have demands of improve working conditions, improve wages for workers, right? But what the Alphabet Workers Union is also looking at is not just those elements, but also about the ethical use of technology. And similarly, I mean, there's been protests at Facebook and right, Google. So I think those are positive movements which are sort of showing that technologists do want to say in how their labor, what their labor is being used for. And I mean, it goes back to the whole Marxist humanism conception that the technologists are sort of demanding that we don't want to be alienated from what the outputs of our labor are going to be used for. We want to have a say. We want to make sure that it's used for good. And I mean, what is good is sort of, I mean, I have a particular definition in terms of removing power inequalities, but could be, right? I mean, different people could have different conceptions, but right. So there's this collectivization movements, and then similarly, there's many such things, right? So what right, we've been talking about participatory design, which actually has largely its roots in even what Shoemaker talked about, appropriate technology, that people should be able to build the tech on their own and control and manage the tech. I mean, the sort of digital equivalent of what Shoemaker talked about in Small is Beautiful. So those are, again, I mean, we're seeing these movements and bits and pieces of groups trying to build technology with the community by really understanding the context. So I mean, all of these are great things to build upon. And I mean, that's what I hope we'll see the world moving towards. And again, I'm hoping that Marx is right. He was right about alienation.
So I want to conclude with one aspect, right? Like you speak of the upcoming systems like AgriStack, where a lot of this could be potentially looked into. Now, we know that the minister has essentially said that this is going to be a FOSS system. Like, at least the claims of it, when we talk about where India is building a lot of these systems, is that, oh, we want to adopt FOSS. But again, it comes in a limitation of a capitalistic imagination where you only want to use it, but not essentially design it with the idea of social good, right? Uh, can you expand a bit on your interest there, and maybe do you think there is a potential for a lot of technologists to intervene because it's an upcoming system and we can still shape how the system is developed?
Yeah, no, I think there is a lot of scope. I think what's also, I mean, one of the positive things. I mean, I am just seeing AgriStack as like coming up in a long history of Aadhaar, then the India Stack, and right in that kind of trajectory. And I think one place where civil society has been successful has been in highlighting that many of these systems actually ignored places where it can go wrong. And I think the process around AgriStack has been more consultative than what some of these earlier systems were. Of course, we don't know how much of these inputs from the civil society and everybody will be taken into account in terms of, but at least I think there have been more consultations, and there has been a good representation also. So, right, so there's definitely scope in that sense to intervene in terms of specifications. And here specifically, right from an intervention in terms of questioning, right, what is the problem that the AgriStack is really trying to solve? I don't think many of these things are clear because, again, it's been looked at as an infrastructure on which innovations can be developed, and these innovations will figure out what they're supposed to be done. So again, I think it's about putting, not thinking in terms of, right, the outcomes first, because that will tell you how to even design it, right? Maybe you don't need an ID for each farmer. Maybe you don't need an ID for each land, right? Maybe if some of the applications you're trying to build are on right, things like connecting markets or making sure people have better access to prices and so on, right? Maybe those things don't require the kind of infrastructure the way it's being imagined. Yeah. But that said, I think if even in the current form, these things do go through, I think the good thing is that they are talking about open source, they are talking about interoperability, and this is again where there might be an opportunity for the FOSS community to build applications, and essentially to also provide a demonstration that how can these applications actually take inputs from the farmers into account. For example, something that I've not seen any AgriStack document talk about is cooperatives. I mean, they're imagining every farmer as an individual entity, but cooperatives are actually one very strong vehicle that can bring a lot of, provide a lot of market power to small and marginal farmers. So how can we think about systems for cooperatives that are integrated into the India Stack and able to use many of these things? Because that could also offer a means of protection in case these technologies go wrong. So I think there's very good opportunities. It's of course a dynamic landscape. So, right, we've got to think about what kind of applications can we build, which are actually meaningful and which will bring change in the right way.
Thank you for that. Thank you for giving you a brief of your book. I would say it's a very long, extended brief. But I have questions. I think Srikanth wants to ask a question. I can unmute him. Srikanth, I think you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah. Thanks, Srinivas. Yeah, and thank you, Professor, for your talk. And I just had a chance to briefly look at your book, and I love the idea of social good. And broadly, if I were to see two aspects, one is around collective decision, participatory decision making, and the second is about like power inequalities and power differentials, right? And I've always like kind of viewed the public good, I mean the Aadhaar and the India stack and the likes, and contrasted that with social harms, where like the harms are not considered, and public good by definition is oblivious to social harm. And I'm just trying to think the reverse of it, like can social goods cause let's say public harm? And while I was kind of thinking around this question, one example which probably I could think of was like how, let's say, LibGen or Sci-Hub, both of which I mean, in my view, I would call them as, say, a social good because they increase access to academic and, let's say, the literature world. At the same time, they have done some damage, let's say, to the publishing industry, and we don't know like the impact of, let's say, books that were not produced because there were not publishers who are profitable anymore, and hence books that were not written, right? So something like that. And I was trying to, and probably one difference that I could see with, let's say, projects such as that and say Gramvani is that Gramvani is more local, and obviously it probably has that feedback loop in, like you mentioned. But I'm just trying to understand, like, have you seen instances of harm, let's say, in social good as well?
Yeah, no. So great question, Shrikant. The point is that I think when it comes to social good, and right, so irrespective of what the technology has been aimed for, it's very important to continuously keep a check on, continuously keep getting feedback on issues that are arising through the technology. So this is where interactions with the user groups are very important. Public spheres, spaces where technologists can be aware of how users are using it or what problems it's causing, right? All of those can be brought up. Right, so that will these inputs will be very important to factor in terms of how to maybe redesign the technology or how to introduce certain usage policies or guidelines into its usage, right? So which are going to be very important. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so technologies for social good, I mean, do lead to harm all the time. I mean, like I was saying, right? I mean, any of the platforms, they do claim that they're doing social good. But I mean, in different ways, right? Facebook is connecting the world, or Uber is trying to bring more income or whatever, more opportunities to drivers and so on. So, I mean, you can say that all of that is social good, but it's about what's being missed out in this whole process. And are you listening to that, and are you reacting to that?
Right.
Anybody else has any other questions? Otherwise, we can.
I do have one question. Hi, I'm Victoria. I've lived for several years in India, and I'm currently based back in Europe. And I work in the tech sphere, often in what are called global accounts, but they never really are, because there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach. And my question to you is, how do you navigate non-disclosure agreements when you are developing new technology, but in order for that technology to really deliver social good, you have to be able to be in that public forum that you were talking about, where you can allow technologists to have access to this. So I'm trying not to ask a closed question, but it's a challenge that I deal with, and we all deal with all the time, is that we're in a commercial setting where we have to put limits and we have to have NDAs. but we also have to have the openness in order to really see those bad actors, those unintended consequences that are so detrimental. Do you have any thoughts on or examples of things that have gone well or suggestions?
So no examples as such come to mind, but I think I think that's part of the point that if technologists do end up exercising more power within their organizations, within their companies, even in a commercial setup, then perhaps I mean they can counter NDAs and right, be more open with their innovations. So like I mean when you enter into an employment contract, actually the intellectual property that you're producing, technically it's yours, but it is employment contract through which you're giving your intellectual property to the company and assigning the ownership. So I think that's one place where I mean there is intervention possible for
a really good point.
Yeah, I mean this intervention could be for keeping the technology free and open source, or it could even be, I mean there's like now ethical source licenses which people are talking about, that the tech should be right, whatever software I produce should be used for certain kinds of goals and not for certain other issues. Right, so that's where I mean there is scope probably to negotiate employment contracts with the companies, so that this intellectual property which is yours, right, you're licensing it under some fair use opportunities.
Thank you. That's an excellent point.
Okay, I was just checking if there are any other questions on other platforms. I don't think there are any. We could close this discussion if anybody else has no more questions. The book's out there. If you need access to a copy, please write to the professor. And I think we can also engage with him beyond this discussion. He's open to participate in a lot of these technology discussions and see how some of these ideas that he has developed could also be further evolved, tweaked, and can be implemented. With that note, I think I will end this discussion. Thank you all for joining.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Srinivas, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, so just wanted to add that I'm really eager to engage in more collaborations, and especially on things like participatory media, which Ramani has been doing, and other areas on agriculture for cooperatives, and also on natural resource management. So if you're interested and we really want to build all of this in very collaborative ways, in engaging with different partners on the ground. So very much open to collaborations, and yeah, so do let me know. And of course, if you need a copy of the book, then just drop me an email and I'll be happy to share.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks everyone. Bye.